And thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to this campaign activation workshop on making the 2030 agenda accountable and what is the role for civil society. My name is Barbara Adams of Global Policy Forum, and together with Roberto Bisio of Social Watch, whom you see, and with Elena Marmo of Global Policy Forum, we are, if you like, the moderators and co-organizers for this particular session. And I have a special word of appreciation for Rina, Yokling, and Ranja, and any of you participants with us from a less than friendly time zone at the moment. I really appreciate that you have taken this time to join us. Eleanor will be moderating the chat and the Q&A, and I encourage you to use that space. It's your space to use throughout the session with your observations, your reactions, and your questions. We have, as you see, also 4 panelists joining us. Chi Yokling from Third World Network, Ranja Sengupta, also Third World Network, Emilia Reyes, Equidad de Género, and Wajarina, Asia Pacific Forum of Women in Law and Development. And we also have a couple of videos for you. So I can hear you yelling at me already. That's far too much to do in just 1 hour. And of course, you're absolutely correct. But this is also true of the SDGs. The SDG agenda, we've only 9 years to go to the 2030 agenda. We're approaching already the halfway mark from when it was adopted. And yet we're in this situation where all assessments are indicating straightforwardly that the targets are off track. There were meetings in UN headquarters earlier this week that were reporting very straightforwardly that poverty is actually increasing for the first time in a couple of decades. And the figures on the increasing number of people in famine, the dynamics with regard to job loss, the escalating debt crisis in so many countries, which is making the actual business of funding the SDGs more and more difficult, frankly, are startling. Now, with this limited time for us, we have decided in this workshop to focus on 2 main areas that are essential for the SDG achievement. The first area is to look at how the SDGs are influenced by so many other issues, and not always positively, and to address how these connections and sometimes obstacles need to be included in our campaigning for implementation. And the second area that we're going to address is the importance of strengthening the accountability of governments and the private sector to live up to the commitments and promises they have made in the 2030 agenda. We will start with a short video, which basically comes from a number of civil society organizations showing the interlinkages, the way in which they're working on the SDGs, but not necessarily specifically calling them by their names. Volume? I don't think this. Elena, can you pause it 1 minute? We don't have any sound. or there's a problem with sound.
I wonder if anyone who isn't, so maybe anyone not speaking, mute their microphones, and I'll see if that improves the quality.
No.
Please click share sound button. Okay, let's see. Okay, we might be good now. Thank you for the tip in the chat.
In 2012, governments unanimously, acting together with employers and workers' representatives within the International Labour Organization, adopted recommendation number 202 on national social protection floors. And in this important recommendation, governments pledged to guarantee to all individuals, women, men and children, throughout their lives, basic income security. This pledge was reiterated in 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, and now is the time to deliver.
But majority of the people do not have any safety mechanism or any safety protection. If we want to assure that everybody has the basic living conditions to have a good life, then yes, social protection must be part of any society that wants to be fair, that wants to be just.
Even after the COVID-19 crisis, it would take no more than $78 billion to make up for the financing gap for all low-income countries. Now, this may sound like a lot, but it is in fact a small fraction of the money that is spent today on economic recovery plans to speed up the economic reconstruction after the COVID-19 crisis. And $78 billion is barely more than 50% of the total official development assistance already provided by rich countries to poor countries. In fact, this sum represents 0.15% of the total wealth created each year by rich countries.
Is that the G20, right, the club of the 20 most economically powerful countries in the world, put together a plan called the Debt Suspension Service Initiative. And the DSSI, as it is termed, is deeply shortcoming. It does not even address the key problems. It merely kicks the can down the road. Why? The campaign is saying because it does not actually restructure or relieve or reduce the debt of global south countries. It just suspends it. It suspends it for 6 months at a time. First 6 months from April 2020 to the fall of to late 2020, and then again into 2021. And it looks like the suspension will just be, incrementally extended. So more is going into repaying private creditors than is going into meeting health and economic needs of the pandemic. This is the world we're living in, where the power of debt is so massive. So to finance and to achieve, the SDGs, the economic and social rights of people, we need to be able to restructure debt in an effective way. Otherwise, that public money will keep, being siphoned out into debt payments rather than into the needs of the people.
In addition, developed countries must take responsibility for contributions to shared commons. Africa is losing approximately $50 billion annually through illicit financial flows. This results in high levels of poverty, inequality, inadequate provisions of social services, and dysfunctional public institutions which entrench gender inequality. Sustainable development requires a financial framework that curbs illicit financial flows and progressive taxation to reduce concentration of wealth and economic power. It requires corporations to pay taxes, refrain from predatory practices, and ensure labor rights, decent work, and working conditions.
As the world's major group with the SDGs and UN human rights mechanisms from a feminist perspective, we're aiming to do three things. So highlight the interplay between Agenda 2030 and the human rights mechanisms of the UN to support and enhance the implementation of the SDGs from a feminist and human rights-based perspective. We're also aiming to increase the knowledge and capacity of our members to interact with UN human rights mechanisms and to utilize the SDGs in their advocacy. And lastly, we're aiming to introduce other rights-based organizations that are working on the intersection of gender equality and UN human rights mechanisms to our members who may also want to work on the interconnections between the SDGs and
While there is some rapid improvement in renewable technologies, the rate of implementation of SDG 7 targets are not in alignment with the systematically interlinked 2030 agenda. The displacement of states, neoliberalism, the obsession with growth, the militarization of economies, and the rise in power of transnational corporations have further exhausted the planet's regenerative biocapacity. Dark money from fossil fuel companies is also perversely undermining civic and democratic processes. These trends are jeopardizing the future of young people and the planet as a whole. We call upon the member states, therefore, on 7 priorities. 1. Increase the leadership of young women and girls in decision-making processes, including policymaking and scientific research, and enable young women and girls to participate in commerce, entrepreneurship, and capital investments for renewable energy away from fossil fuels. 2. Ensure decent job opportunities and skills training as we rapidly move away from fossil fuels for a just transition. 3. End fossil fuel subsidies, then redirect them towards energy efficiency and renewable energy. 4. Remove investment assets in fossil fuel companies from your sovereign wealth funds and pension funds and instead invest in renewable energy infrastructure. 5. Internalize externalities by using carbon pricing instruments. Polluters should pay. 6. Fulfill your commitments to resource the Green Climate Fund to achieve the implementation of the Paris Agreement. 7th and last, prioritize vision casting of a clean future. Member states must empower educators, civil society, and industry associations to educate the public for a collective imagination of an inclusive, equitable, prosperous, and sustainable future that is fully decarbonized and electrified from clean, sustainable sources of energy. You said you would through the Article 12 of the Paris Agreement.
So, are you feeling exhausted? Okay. Most of these excerpts, many of them taken during the high-level political forum with civil societies addressing member states, were actually from before the last year, when we have all been confronted with the COVID-19, with the virus. With possibly the exception of Bhumika talking about the debt crisis. The debt crisis was a pre-existing condition which has clearly been exacerbated enormously by COVID-19. Before I turn to Yok Ling and ask her to talk some more about some of the work that is talking about the interlinkages and the consequences of the virus, I'd like you all to fill out a very short poll, because we would be interested to see your views on how you see the relationship between COVID-19 and the SDGs. You can see you have 3 choices with regard to the relationship with the SDGs being more important, displacing the SDGs as the primary agenda, and the importance of sequencing. And I think maybe everybody who's going to click their button has done so at this stage. So the overwhelming, now maybe we're at the SDG festival and we shouldn't be surprised. The overwhelming response is, which basically says it makes the SDGs even more important. Thanks, Elena. I'm going to turn to Yok Ling. Yokling, one of the things that we are focusing on in this particular workshop is the linkages with other campaigns. And you are at the forefront of the campaign with regard to the people's vaccine. Please, could you tell us how, from your point of view, you see the relationship, why this is an intimate connection or not between People's Campaign and achieving the SDGs? And I'm sorry, I know you're tired, so maybe you'll be pleased with what I'm about to say. I'm sorry, you've got a maximum of 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you. Thank you to Global Policy Forum, Roberto and Eleanor, for putting this together. Yeah, I think that, the COVID-19 pandemic, as all of us have observed over the past 12 months, an incredible 12 months, really, what we see as the fallout, no surprise. Yeah, those of us working around the issues of systemic change, the 2030 agenda, not just the SDGs, but the entire 2030 agenda, which is complex, systemic, and challenging. Not new either, because we started this comprehensive approach in 1992 with Agenda 21. So what COVID has done is really just, shown how deep the failure has been of the wealthy, of those who have power, who have failed to make those systemic changes. So if we see that most countries in the world have not been vaccinated today, while you have a lot of celebration in the United States, in the UK, that by this summer, everyone would practically be vaccinated. There are countries in the South that have not even begun to be vaccinating on a significant scale. And what is very interesting, Europe is in scrambles. Europe is actually fighting for vaccines in a different way from the rest of us in the South. And this belies really the manifestation of the structural injustices that 2030 the agenda tries to address. So when we talk about the people's vaccine, we're talking about a global public good. The people's vaccine is a very specific campaign, it's a call, but let's unpack what that means. It means that we are living in a world where until 1995, there was no international obligation, no international rule that requires that every country has to give multiple patents, even one patent, to any life-saving medicine or a vaccine or a diagnostic. It's only in 1995 with the TRIPS agreement, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, that the WTO is now famous for administering. Before this, it was a choice. If societies feel that life-saving medicines cannot and should not be patented, research, most of our breakthroughs in research for polio, for so many things, were not patented. And even today, as we saw in COVID, billions have been actually funded from the public pocket. And in the United States, it's very shameful. The biggest, promoter and defender of proprietary private rights, the United States government, because it has put so much money into the research, not just COVID-19 vaccines, but before that, they own those technologies. And yet they actually hand it over and give monopolies to the private corporations. So there is not a shortage because there's no capacity. There's a shortage because we did not allow capacity for vaccine production. And even those who can manufacture today cannot because of these intellectual property barriers. And it's not just patents, it's trade secrets for technology know-how. It's copyright, just the information itself is not allowed to be shared. So I am very optimistic because in the midst of all this, we see also unprecedented, a huge campaign globally. We never imagined this a year ago, 10 months ago, a call for a temporary suspension of the Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, right? Temporary suspension for COVID. A few countries are blocking, the rest of the world is moving. More than 250 European parliamentarians have signed on, and it's growing. We're seeing it in mainstream media, Financial Times, Bloomberg, New York Times. It's not a marginal thing, it's huge. And it's shameful that the rich are protected by a few politicians because the call is also very strong in the North. So what is the connection? The connection is that the big challenge for us now is that this pandemic and around the vaccine is only one aspect, shows that the systemic challenges are deep. And it's not just the poor countries. Most of the poor, as we know, are in the so-called middle income countries, like Malaysia, my little country. And across Latin America and much of Asia and parts of Africa. And they are the ones who have to buy every dose of vaccine. So we're not talking about the poor countries having a few pieces of, charity to be given to them. We have overhoarding. We've seen all that. It's nothing new. But this really shows not just the SDG, the 2030 agenda with this entire package needs to be addressed. So for me, and many of us around the table and beyond, it's not just about a temporary waiver. We need to take the TRIPS agreement out of our lives because it has no place. It has no place in a planet that has ecological crisis, health crisis, and economic crisis. Thank you.
And I think one of the things as well we know is that the UN, and I believe the Secretary General, has also come out in support of the people's vaccine. And so the people's vaccine, as Jokling has pointed out, is really on the move. It's also being explored, debated, decided in other fora. Not in the main fora where we actually address the SDGs. And I want to ask Ranja now Ranja Sengupta, to offer us one or two things that you think would be very helpful in the whole trade arena, which you follow very, very closely, that could also, if you like, be included in campaigning essential to achieve the SDGs. Now, I know the trade agenda is massive, and I know I'm asking you something really difficult. So don't give us the background. Tell us what we need to do.
Thank you, Barbara. And let me just maybe start with 2-3 lines of background. So why is international trade at all important for sustainable development? We know we have many trade related targets in the whole 2030 agenda and in the SDGs. And that is because one is international trade is supposed to generate revenues and resources for governments, because if they can export, earn revenues, they can directly finance their sustainable development objectives and the SDGs. But what we have been very concerned about is that trade can actually act, because there are a number of trade and investment agreements that I'm sure all of you know that are kind of proliferating in the world today between countries across the world. And they put down rules which are binding, legally binding rules, because governments can be sued and punished if they don't follow the rules. And so these rules can act either as an enabler or as a barrier for the policies that they need to implement to meet the SDGs. So for example, if a government wants to take certain health policy, they may be faced with trade rules which is actually not allowing them to do so. So for me, Barbara, you said that yes, trade is indeed a massive issue, right? Because everything under the sun is actually in our globalized world today is in trade. But therefore, my ask is also, I think, massive, but absolutely critical, I think, today. I would say we need trade policy space for sustainable development. Not just the SDGs, but even beyond, because sustainable development to me is bigger and broader than SDGs. But yes, the governments also need trade policy space to meet even SDGs. Now, the poll was interesting because it compared COVID to the SDGs. And for me also, I had agreed with the first question, because COVID and this crisis really shows that it is, inclusive in the sustainable development framework. We realize that, we have done things so unsustainably that we will face such crisis, not only the COVID one, but environmental one, many other crises will come to haunt us. And that's because we have not followed a path of sustainable development. So COVID is very much part of this, and addressing COVID, so COVID is actually a great example, the pandemic, that governments we see when we follow, because we follow the trade agreements and, who's kind of implementing in whichever way, how does it interact with government's national policy making. And when governments are trying to take measures to address COVID, they can be challenged under these rules of the trade agreements. So if they, use industrial subsidies, they may notify a hospital as a COVID facility, they may have to do lockdown, they may need to impose a tax to raise revenues. All these could be challenged under the rules of these trade and investment agreements. So, for example, through multiple chapters and multiple provisions. So from the investment chapters, many of you may have heard of the now infamous investor state dispute settlement, which allows foreign investors to sue governments for following even development policy, environment policy, if it is seen to reduce the company's profits. So from investment chapters, from service chapters, from intellectual property rights, these so-called affirmative actions and policies of governments can be challenged. So we have been seeing that, actually using the ISDS for governments who tried to raise revenue for COVID, they were actually sued under the ISDS. And in addition, governments are also losing these big cases, paying out huge amounts. For example, my country, India, lost a $1.4 billion in ISDS case. Pakistan lost a $6 billion. And you can imagine that in the time of the pandemic, this means government will not be able to buy vaccines, to create the infrastructure, to get the medical personnel, pay the medical personnel they need. So yes, my ask would be trade policy space for sustainable development. And you'll see, I'm saying not just for addressing crisis, but for sustainable development. So I'm talking about carving out bigger policy space from trade agreements. And if you are our agreements, actually we did an SDG compatibility impact assessment of our trade agreements, they would fail miserably. So just to end, I think our campaign really should be to redesign, reshape all our trade and investment agreements so that they allow our governments and even us as a society enough space to put in the policies that we need to meet this big holistic framework of SDGs and sustainable development. And the beginning for me would be a moratorium on all these agreements, provisions, and chapters, which would include what Yokling talked about. For example, intellectual property rights and the TRIPS agreement, which is actually huge, and that should actually go beyond the waiver. We need to talk and challenge and reshape those frameworks. So I think that's a big task. I'm putting in front of all of us.
Your passion.
I think we can do it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you so much. I think it's a brave summary. And wow, so far we have heard about so many campaigns that are involving civil society around the world. The SEEN campaign, trade campaign, debt campaign, human rights, of course, women's rights. How do we make sense of these campaigns? Are we dispersing our energy, offering people a very, very big menu to choose from? Or is it possible to somehow have them confluence? Emilia, you are very active, promoting, defending, imagining a campaign of campaigns. What is this about?
Yes, hello everybody, and so pleased to be in this lineup of panelists, and so very grateful for the invitation, and of course being in this forum and imagining a bit beyond the SDGs, meaning that the SDGs are an agenda, but there are obstacles to those, and sometimes, and what we are talking about, Roberto, here is that there are global obstacles. So the SDGs have been focusing on national implementation or national reporting, but we've been insisting that without addressing extraterritorial impacts, without addressing systemic and structural global and macro issues, there is no way any country is gonna meet the targets. And this is very concerning because also I'd say from the point of view of developed and powerful countries, they've been blocking our proposals on addressing systemic issues precisely because it's easier to point out the responsibility on national countries rather than dealing with their slots in which they're exercising power. So what we are doing in the idea of the campaign of campaigns, this is a conception that we had in the in the Financing for Development group, as well as the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development, we think that all of these macro agendas are interconnected. And let me just be very clear. Macro is the aggregated of the micro. So we are also minding what is happening at the local level, what is happening on those individual lives, like women who are migrating with having no access to rights, like people with disabilities who have no access to public services, indigenous peoples who are now struggling to have access to the vaccines, etc. So what we're trying to pack is what are the main asks that all of the social movements, all of the economic and environmental movements should rally around, because all of these agendas are impacting and are impacting negatively the achievement of our targets. So I'm gonna paste the link of the campaign of campaigns here, but I just wanted to go very quickly into what are we calling. Of course, we have overarching principles like human rights, gender equality, the well-being, social, economic, and environmental justice, etc. You will check on the website. But we are calling as well for a new global economic architecture that works for people and the planet. And this means a whole review on what is happening, who's making the decisions. We know that so far only the rich countries are having access to the G7, the G20, OECD, the Paris Club, and they are making all the decisions. And they're also blocking the decisions somewhere else, for instance, in the United Nations, or as Jokling and Ranja were saying, in the WTO. So it is really important that we take a step back and think that the system that we have so far at the global level is not responding to what we need. So it's not only about the local effort, it's really about understanding that the obstacles may be placed somewhere else. So going to the second demand, of course, is debt cancellation for developing countries in this context, and also starting with a sovereign debt workout mechanism at the United Nations, which would mean that countries will not be negotiating one-on-one. We could place a set of rules to discuss why is debt impacting so many historical conditions in developing countries. We are also calling, thirdly, on establishing an UN tax convention for redistributive justice. We saw in the video those figures about Africa being depleted and bloated from their resources to the global north. We know that now that Africa is a net creditor to the developed countries, precisely because of all of the flows that are coming from our poorer countries to the richer ones by means of tax havens and many mechanisms. So we are thinking really that there needs to be an universal body that is regulating all of these flows. And fourth, we are asking for a global technology assessment mechanism at the UN. We are very mindful of the negative impacts that the digital companies are having globally. We are talking as well about a hyper-capitalism that is digital in its nature, extracting data and extracting many resources now, and are actually supporting the depletion of our natural resources, for example, in technologies such as GMOs, etc. So this is really important ask. And then fifth, we're definitely asking to assess the current trade and investment framework. I won't dwell into that because Ranja and Jokling have been very, very great in explaining this. But then the sixth is precisely assessing the systemic risks posed by the financial sector instruments and actors. We've seen now, for instance, that the Green Climate Fund is asking for 100 million a year till 2020, and we know that not only it hasn't met the goals, but actually there are just individual private actors like the Chase Bank that is bringing their investments to fossil fuels in a triple amount that what the Green Climate Fund is bringing. So these are figures that we need to know that the financial sector that is
Emilia, I'm giving you another 30 seconds, sorry.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go that we need to control the public and private investments and the private finance first, and finally to make the rich countries to allocate their commitments on official development assistance. I will paste the link here, and we would love also people to join the campaign of campaigns, because all of these demands are interrelated. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you actually to everybody who is so active in the chat. It's for those who've had the opportunity, there's a lot of really, really good comments and questions and ideas there. Amelia, I think maybe without realizing it, in a way has moved us to the second main area that we want to address in this very, very tight workshop. And that is related to the whole question of accountability. A number of the asks that she said were actually to do with the architecture, actually to do with the governance and accountability framing, particularly at the global level, that are not, at the moment anyway, the focus, as she said, was so much on national, and it doesn't take into consideration the imbalances that we have at the global level, where clearly we have very large imbalances with small, medium, large states and a whole range of different priorities. I think we're very clear, accountability is weak. When the SDGs were adopted, the high-level political forum was created at the same time specifically to monitor and report on the SDGs. And it meets every year at UN headquarters after a series of reviews that take place otherwise, thematic reviews, as well as reviews at regional levels. And I think we also have from those reviews this new mechanism called voluntary national reviews. And so we have also voluntary national reviews that have been reported each year at the high-level political forum. And I think everybody was surprised how many governments actually signed up to do a voluntary national review. Now, clearly, what we're talking about here today is too much work for any one organization to take on, okay? And what would be really helpful, and I want to go to the second poll very quickly to you, is to have some reactions from you about how you see the relationship of the accountability at different levels. And this poll in particular is asking you about how the global accountability mechanisms along the high-level political forum and the VNRs actually influence the work at local, national, and regional levels, and how it supports or not the work that is taking place with regard to that campaigning for the SDGs. I have to say that we have a very, very clear thinking bunch of participants. The answers, there's a very strong majority in certain directions here. It's getting a little bit, I see one of the lines is tracking out a little. Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, I wonder, Roberto, do you want to say a little bit more about the experience of the VNRs? Because one of the things that has been really noteworthy, and as I've mentioned already, a little bit surprising from when we started this agenda, is not only how many countries have done VNRs, but the whole variety of different ways in which civil society have engaged or not engaged, depending in lots of cases on opportunities more, I think, at the national level.
Yes, I think that the first thing to notice is how popular the voluntary national reviews actually are. You can see this world map where the countries in blue are the countries that have submitted 1, 2, or 3 VNRs in the last 5 years or are programmed to do so in 2021. And the countries in red are the countries that have not submitted any single VNR and will not do so this year. Very clearly, you have a lot of failed states in that list, or so-called failed states, countries in conflict, countries torn by civil war, like or outright war, like Yemen, Somalia, Eritrea, and one big country over there that also doesn't pay any attention. But the point is that all the rest of the world, a great majority of the governments of the world, have felt committed to go to the United Nations and say, this is what we are doing for the SDGs. Now, quality of the reports might be good, very good, not so good. Civil society may or may not have participated in it, but just by submitting a report, which is published, it either is the result of a discussion process or it kicks off a discussion, because even if it is not so-called legally binding as the human rights framework could be, it is politically and morally binding as the governments are presenting their accounting and making themselves accountable for what they have done. In the next slide, we can see we did a survey, Global Policy Forum and Social Watch, among dozens of organizations that took part or engaged with the UN over the last years about their own participation as civil society in the VNR process. And we see there that over one third of the respondents have participated in the VNRs. An interesting observation is that the survey also asked people whether their governments had engaged civil society or whether the local UN offices had engaged civil society in the preparation of the VNR process. And actually, only 20% responded that there was a consultation, an official consultation for the national review. But the fact that many more civil society organizations participated than those that were officially consulted means that civil society finds their own ways through parallel shadow or spotlight reports or through other mechanisms to participate and engage with the process even when not officially invited. That is what civil society's power and inventive is about, after all.
One of the things as well, and that was included there, is the way in which we've witnessed at the HLPF each year, the way in which civil society has really also taken the opportunity to challenge some of the findings that they hear with regard to their governments during these VNRs. We have a very, very short video before I turn to Rina to show you two examples of how the global accountability mechanism has also provided a platform for our work. And I will turn off my sound, as will anyone.
Increasing deforestation and biodiversity loss has major consequences for food security and human health. Achieving the necessary global targets, for example, of halting deforestation by 2020 and reducing biodiversity loss, requires national policies to reflect strong rights-based approaches. These approaches must be bottom-up and fully respect the rights and the free, prior and informed consent of indigenous people, local communities, women and other rights holder groups.
The UK VNR has failed to demonstrate accelerated ambition to implement the SDGs. Without a comprehensive delivery plan, the UK will not be able to tackle the critical gaps in achieving the goals or reverse the policies leading to regression. There is lack of progress in tackling the multiple factors that lead to inequalities. Recent evidence from the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights noted the disproportionate impact of UK austerity policies on the poorest, on women, people with disabilities, children, ethnic minorities, migrants, and other marginalised groups.
Unmute yourself, Barbara.
Unmute, yes, yes. I was too conscientious and then forgot. No, what I was going to say in introducing Rina is how Rina has been so actively involved nationally, yes, definitely with regional activities, engaging also with the UN at regional level, also at the global level, tremendously active with the Women's Major Group, and also been one of the co-authors of a study. It's more than a study, it's a set of recommendations which are currently being engaged with member states on actually how to strengthen and improve the the high-level political forum, including the VNRs. So here I go again, Rina. Really pleased you're here. Really pleased you have so much experience and really not giving you very much time. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And I totally agree with you, Barbara. We've seen more and more local and national civil society holding their government and the private sector, not only their government, accountable at the global and regional level. I'm actually in Bangkok right now, and then we just held our 5 days People's Forum before the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development. So it's a regional forum on sustainable development. And our big theme is actually solidarity and system change are the only antidotes to COVID-19. And then now we're in the middle of the APFSD, or Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development. And then in this whole week, I think that in addition to the stories of impact of COVID-19 crisis to women, to Dalits, to indigenous peoples, to migrants, and also the other groups, we have heard a very horrifying stories from the region on the brutal junta oppression, for instance, in Myanmar, farmers' protests in India, conflict in Kashmir, trade union and workers crackdown in Indonesia when they are opposing pro-corporate job creation law, ISDS case in Pakistan, attack to young protesters of Thailand, so many stories of oppression, and yet also followed by story of struggle and resistance by the feminist and people's movement. What I'm trying to say here is actually, you know, a lot of people also been using SDG as a tool to actually, you know, push for accountability and demand accountability to the government and also the private sector. And that is not only for the sake of, you know, looking into the progress of SDG itself. So I think from our end, the conclusion of our People's Forum was very clear that there are escalation of the patriarchal authoritarian regime, the rise of macho fascist leaders in our region that flexing military power and etc. But it's also, it cannot be de-linked from the existing and increasing faults in our current global and social systems, such as capitalism, corporatization of development, unjust trade and investment agreement, like what Ranja mentioned, land and resource grabbing, patriarchy, militarism, and so forth. So what we are trying to do in the region and also in the women major group, just like what you say, we are trying to propose something, and then we are trying to say, we want system change, and then we're really clear on what we meant by the system change. So we are actually, like what you said, that we are actually propose something to the HLPF review discussion. We really highlight, you know, being the woman major group and also APRSEM, the Asia Pacific Regional CSO engagement mechanism, we really want to highlight that there's a need to actually shift the discussion in the high-level political forum that is not only talking about the progress of the SDG, but when there's a lack of progress, what is actually the systemic issue, the systemic barriers that make it happen, right? So we really want to track that kind of systemic challenges. We want to look into how the issue of global economic trade, tax, monetary and financial framework, militarism, and then also social and cultural norms such as patriarchy, fundamentalism, racism, casteism is actually hindering the SDG implementation. So for that, we actually have like some proposal. We're aiming to actually address the inequalities of wealth, power, and resources between countries, between rich and poor, and between men and women and other social groups. Our proposal is actually to address the issue of inequality of wealth. We propose that we want to have a topic that not talking about build back better. We don't really, we have like some opposition of that, but it's actually building back differently, which is like focus on transforming to a just global economic governance that we have, and then really look into ways to actually shift and then also prioritize underlying macroeconomic, financial, and trade structural injustices and inequalities. And then to address the inequalities of power, we actually need to building back justly. This is how we reduce inequalities and also sustaining peace. This theme is actually more like an intersection of development and peace, with the recognition of the increased importance of the humanitarian development peace nexus, and then also tackling the discrimination, patriarchy, racism, casteism, the one that I mentioned before. And lastly, to address the inequalities of resources, we actually need to building back sustainably, like really looking into the tackling climate change and sustainable use of natural resources. So for that, if you want to look into the systemic issues and then really want to look into the comprehensive understanding and then really scrutinizing that systemic barriers, there is no way that we can do it through a cluster approach. It's very siloed. It's it won't give us a big picture. We need to actually really like rejecting it because it's not working. So that's why we have been pushing for a non-cluster approach. We want to actually have all the 17 goals to actually discuss in the same time in relation with the theme that we are talking before that. So I just want to add you one more thing. I know that I'm probably over my time. The civil societies in Asia Pacific is also offer something else. We have a political unity as a platform. We are political platform. Yeah, we have a development justice model that look into the issue of and how we shift into a redistributive justice. Economic justice, social and gender justice, environmental justice, and accountability to the peoples. And then for that, we decided that, look, we are not, if we want to look into the systemic issues, if we want to track it, then we really need to have a sort of like a documentation and report about it. We want to track using our own development justice indicator. Like for instance, like for now in terms of recovery, number of COVID-19 recovery fund that goes to corporate bailout, for instance, instead of social protection, that track, for instance, government's progressive taxation measure to mobilize domestic resources, or to compare, the amount of public health and education budget to military, or the number of health workers, public health workers compared to military personnel. So I think that this is the thing that we can actually do it together from the people, and then really pushing for accountability, make some voice and amplify our voices, and also make some noise. Thank you so much, Barbara. So if it's too long.
You're still with us. We're all still with each other. Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I'm looking at the clock. I've done a reasonably bad job in the last half of this program. But I've also been looking at the chat, and I can see that you've all compensated for my bad timekeeping by being very busy communicating with each other. One of the things I'd like to say, and I hope that we continue to have access after this is over to the chat, and there are a number of questions and comments there, and that we will respond to them and share information that is there and share suggestions of people who've put them in the chat with the others of us that are here present today. Some of the things that I've picked up from looking through the chat, it's pretty clear, right? On the one hand, that the SDGs are a universal agenda. This isn't only with regard to, for example, being supported by ODA flows from traditional donor countries to developing countries. We are looking at all kinds of different players in society. And as you can also tell, there's absolutely no doubt that we need to improve our indicators, our measurements, our criteria, our rules of participation to also differentiate the more powerful from the less powerful, whether that's within countries or whether that's between countries. Because once we actually all get around the table together, that power imbalance does not disappear. And I think that's something that has come through in a whole variety of different ways in this particular conversation. The other thing that's coming through extremely clearly is there's a tremendous amount of activity that the SDGs are a real aspirational agenda, but we are coming across so many obstacles to their being achieved, whether the obstacles are direct because of the fossil fuel subsidies, whether the obstacles are by neglect, because they haven't come to the top of the agenda in a whole variety of different ways, that they live only in one political governance space. And what we are talking about and what we've illustrated today very clearly is that this agenda, if it's a universal agenda and is as super relevant as most of the people who are saying, everybody says we're here to support and promote the SDGs across all sectors, but they're not held accountable in the various different fora, whether it's the WTO or etc., for actually how those particular policies are actually measured in terms of how they impact or do not impact the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's an enormous agenda. I think we all know that. And the agenda is far too large for any one of us, any one organization to take on, which is why we tried today to give you a snapshot, not only of the fantastic work that so many people are doing around the world, but also a snapshot of some of the campaigns, some of the organizing, some of the expertise, and some of the energy that we can see in all kinds of places. If you feel that that is, first of all, know it's there, you're not alone. But secondly, if you want to know more about it or reach out or participate, or even, and one of the things I would like to say, and I'm looking at the clock, so I'm really aware that whatever the cut is that happens at the magic hour is about to happen. One of the things that I would also like to say is that we do so much quality work, and we end up presenting it usually into only one policy stream. And let's start thinking about how we can use this analysis, this people's voices experience, into other policy scenes to cut across a little bit, like Rina was just saying, whether it's different in some of the peacekeeping areas, whether it's particular, not only in the health field, think of the social protection, which focuses very much on the ILO in lots of cases, but is a lot of that work being taken boldly to the World Trade Organization? I don't know. But I think that we could also think about ways in which we can magnify and multiply our own work, as well as feeling, I hope, some support to know. And thank you all seriously very much for knowing that we are definitely all out there, even if we don't know everybody else's name. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, the panelists, and thank you for the participants and all you chatters. You're wonderful chatters. I've been, part of the reason my excuse is because I've been so busy reading the chat. Bye all.
Bye.